But we begin with the Biden administration and the acceleration of its efforts to prevent and detect and treat long COVID.
That's right. The U.S. Health and Human Services Secretary revealed this development Tuesday, one day after the Centers for Disease Control announced plans to revamp the agency. The CDC has faced criticism for its handling of the pandemic and, at times, its confusing messaging. Criticism of the agency has been echoed by the New York Times bestselling author Michael Lewis. In his book, The Premonition, A Pandemic Story, Lewis details how a, quote, small, informal, almost secret group of doctors tried to convince leading health officials in the country to mitigate the spread of COVID-19 long before they did.
And Lewis also hosts Against the Rules, a podcast that explores unfairness in American life. Pushkin Industries recently released the first and second episodes of season 3, which tackles this subject by examining different experts of different practices across the country. And Michael Lewis joins us now. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Such a pleasure.
We always find it so interesting and what inspires you to write a book or tackle a different topic. During the pandemic, we were also reactive. I know you wanted to write The Premonition about this molecular biologist, and then it spiraled into something else.
So what it was actually was my previous book, The Fifth Risk, had been about sort of the government's the potential mismanagement of big risks inside the federal government, because we've been neglecting these risk management tools for so long, and the people who did it, who were great. Like, it was really impressive when I was going around the government, who was there to, for example, deal with a pandemic. But they felt poorly led and starved of resources. And the question was like, when something happens, how are we going to handle it? And then this happens.
Right.
And so I didn't, for me, what was so interesting about the story, it's not really exactly about the pandemic and then it ends in May of 2020. It was sort of all these people who were trying to prepare us for it and kind of warn us about it, and whose experience before the pandemic give you a very good idea of the problems that were going to occur once we had one. So like criticisms of the CDC, I didn't go in thinking like the CDC had done a bad job or anything like that. The characters in the public health system who had been dealing with them for the previous 2 decades saw that they really weren't equipped to like play the role of battlefield commander if there was like a serious disease outbreak.
Well, tell us about this little group that tried to get word out early on when COVID-19 was sort of first on the scene, and they lacked the power to get their voice out. What happened to that group, and why didn't anyone listen to them? It's
kind of great that 7 doctors come together and call themselves the Wolverines. But they were not just anybody. They were people who had been in the Bush administration when the pandemic plan had been written. They had written it, and the 2 of them, and then some younger doctors around them who'd stayed in the Obama administration. So these people had experience in government and had actually authored the plan we were meant to execute. And they were just like a step away from the White House when this happened. If this had happened in the beginning of the Trump administration, there were people in the Trump administration who knew them, who were planning to bring them in to run any pandemic. But those people had been fired. The institutional memory of their existence had vanished. So they were kind of like out in the wilderness when this happens. And they really were arguably the best people to manage the situation, or at least be in the ear of a president. And so where they are instead is like functioning almost as private citizens, watching this thing in Wuhan. And the email chains in January, they're screaming to the rafters, why isn't the CDC doing something about this?
What you're describing sounds like the movie Don't Look Up.
It's similar. It's the same problem, right? The problem is the relationship of the people who know to the people who are making the decisions. And they're too far away. And the people who were genuinely expert didn't really get in the room when the decisions were being made. And that's a really odd thing. I mean, we were judged before the pandemic to be best prepared for a pandemic of any country on the planet by people who evaluate this sort of stuff, because we had this know-how, and the know-how was just like not managed properly. And
it's alarming to hear you mention these emails that were coming out in January.
Right.
You're very critical of the CDC in this book, and we want to point out that we reached out to the CDC for a comment. They did not respond. But what do you blame it on? I mean, you mentioned the emails, and they didn't have the right characters.
Because they had this sterling reputation, right? They were a really admired and trusted institution. But I think that reputation was earned in the 60s and the 70s. And you know what I blame it on?
Outdated.
Actually, is changes in the structure, and this is across the federal government this has happened. The head of the CDC used to be a career civil servant. He had some distance from the political process. He wasn't appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. The minute that was changed in the 1980s during the Reagan administration, the place became an increasingly politically sensitive place. And the person running it was on a shorter leash from the political process. It changed the culture of the institution. It became more, and it's very hard to run something like a pandemic if you're at the mercy of day-to-day political whims, because it is you're making decisions in conditions of uncertainty. They're going to upset some people.
Well, some of the stuff you're also exploring in your podcast, right? So you talk about this idea of an L6. Can you explain to our viewers what that is and how that factors into all of this?
The level 6 in the organization, on an organization chart, in a complicated organization like yours, like a big company, like a government agency, the argument is that if something happens that the organization needs to respond to, like a crisis, a problem, and there's some expertise needed, it's never at the top. It's someone way down who has that specific knowledge. And if the organization doesn't have the ability to bubble up the expert and find the person down there who knows, and they often weirdly don't, the problems don't get solved. And when you look at
So you're saying 6 levels is too much? If something has to go up 6 levels, that's too much?
You know what they're going to be, in big organizations, they're going to be 6 levels. The levels need to be porous. It's basically a problem of inequality, that when you have the person at the top is so important, and you get down here and this person's not important, they never get a chance to speak to that person. It's that person's up here's job to knock through the walls, knock through the floors, and get to the down there to figure out who actually knows. And it's the nature of expertise. It's local. It's special.
But the picture you're painting is very scary, because it's obviously not just pandemics we're worried about. There's all kinds of things looming in the future that are pretty scary. And if everything that we have to deal with on a crisis level has to go through so many.
Well, that's what's so frustrating for Americans is they're watching this play out and they want answers.
They know that someone knows. They're just not on the camera.
The people
they're not
that know
talking to them.
are not getting to where they need to be.
That's right.
Michael Lewis, author of The Premonition and host of the podcast Against the Rules. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
A real pleasure having you here.
Great.